is he dead?
We were hoping that you could shed some light on that.
I don't know what it is.
Marissa?
In Wausau, Wisconsin, the job of a babysitter is simple in theory, but sacred in practice. Protect the child, care for the child, return the child safely. But in 2018, one woman shattered that sacred trust in the most horrifying way imaginable. Her name was Marissa Tietsort, and she would go down as one of the most infamous babysitters in American history. Marissa Tietsort wasn't a stranger to the families of Wausau. She was a mother herself, someone who other parents assumed would understand what it meant to love and protect a child. But behind closed doors, her behavior was disturbing. She had a history with Child Protective Services. She had been flagged before for unsafe conditions. And yet, parents, many young, working, and desperate for affordable childcare, kept leaving their children in her hands. On October 18th, 2018, a mother dropped off her 2-month-old son at Tiesort's home. He was healthy, smiling, and wrapped in the kind of fragile innocence only infants carry. Hours later, when that mother returned, Marissa Tietsort did something so chilling it would haunt investigators, prosecutors, and the entire community. She handed the baby back as if he was sleeping. She had dressed him in a tiny snowsuit, buckled him into his car seat, and even pulled the hood over his head. What the mother didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that her son was already dead. Tietsort had violently assaulted the infant earlier that day. The coroner's report would later reveal blunt force trauma to his head, injuries no baby could survive. Instead of calling for help, instead of rushing to save him, she made a decision that defied all human empathy. She staged him. She posed him. She returned him to his mother in a grotesque performance of normalcy, leaving the woman to drive home with her lifeless child in the backseat. It wasn't until that mother unbuckled him and tried to wake him that the horrifying truth emerged. What makes the story even more infuriating is what Marissa Tietsort did after the killing. Instead of taking responsibility, she went to McDonald's with her boyfriend and her own children, smiling, eating, and pretending as if nothing had happened. To her, it was just another day. The investigation that followed uncovered a deeply disturbing pattern. This wasn't the first time she had been accused of harming children. Court records revealed that just months before the October tragedy, she had been charged with child abuse in a separate case, involving an 11-month-old who suffered injuries under her care. But while those charges were pending, she kept babysitting. She kept inviting parents to trust her. And tragically, they did. In January 2019, she was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide. The courtroom would later hear every disturbing detail: how she lied to investigators, how she manipulated parents, and how she continued to babysit despite a court order forbidding her from being around children. At trial, prosecutors painted her as cold and calculating. They emphasized the deception, the way she dressed the infant, buckled him in, and returned him as if asleep. It wasn't just cruelty, they argued. It was a cover-up, designed to buy her time and shift suspicion away. The defense tried to cast doubt, suggesting inconsistencies in the medical examiner's findings, but the evidence was overwhelming. The coroner was clear. The baby had suffered catastrophic head trauma, injuries no accident could explain. The most haunting testimony came from the victim's mother. She recounted, through tears, the moment she realized her child wasn't sleeping, the desperate attempts to revive him, and the unbearable weight of knowing she had trusted the wrong person.
Please go to that babysitter's house. She has another child there. Okay. And he was like delusional when we picked him up. He could not even open his eyes. No, arrest her now! It's gone. Somebody get that baby! No!
The jury sat in silence. Even hardened courtroom veterans admitted it was one of the most devastating testimonies they had ever heard. In 2022, Marissa Tietsort was sentenced to 40 years in prison, followed by 20 years of extended supervision. The judge didn't hold back. He called her actions the ultimate betrayal of trust and a danger to every child she ever touched. For many in Wisconsin, it felt like justice, but for the families who had left their children with her, the scars would never fully heal. Even after her sentencing, new details continued to surface. Many asked, how was she allowed to keep babysitting? Why wasn't the system stronger? Why did it take the death of a baby for the law to finally stop her? Today, Marissa Tietsort sits in a Wisconsin prison. She will be in her 60s before she even has the chance of freedom. But for the families she betrayed, and for a community still reeling, that is little comfort. The mother who trusted her that day will never forget handing her son to a babysitter, only to get back a staged corpse, dressed as if asleep.
I came out, all I did was pee. I came out, there was black everywhere, but I went straight for the kids. I couldn't see anything. I'm so sorry, I don't know what to do.
In Houston, Texas, 2011, parents dropped their children off at what they believed was a safe haven. A small state-registered daycare run out of a home. It was called Jackie's Childcare, operated by a 22-year-old woman named Jessica Tata. To many parents, Tata seemed like a young, responsible caregiver, someone who wanted to build a career in child services. But what happened behind those doors revealed something far darker: recklessness, negligence, and a decision so catastrophic that left 4 children dead and a community demanding answers. On the morning of February 24th, 2011, Tata was watching 7 toddlers and infants, all under the age of 4. These were children who couldn't speak for themselves, who depended entirely on the adults around them for safety and survival. But that morning, Jessica Tata made a decision that would end their lives. She left the house, climbed into her Ford Escape, and drove to a nearby Target store to shop for groceries. Inside the home, on the stove, she left a pan of oil heating. It was a recipe for disaster. The oil caught fire, flames spread quickly, and within minutes, the entire home was engulfed. Smoke poured into the daycare rooms, filling cribs and playpens where toddlers sat helpless. Neighbors would later testify to the sound of screams, the sight of black smoke pouring from the windows, and the horrifying knowledge that babies were trapped inside. By the time firefighters arrived, it was already too late for 4 of them. 16-month-old Elias Castillo, 20-month-old Elizabeth Koja, 2-year-old Shamari Dickerson, and 3-year-old Kendall Stratford all perished in the flames. 3 other children were pulled out alive but critically injured, their small bodies scarred for life. And where was Jessica Tata during this chaos? Security footage later revealed her calmly shopping at Target, browsing aisles as the fire raged in her home. By the time she returned, the house was surrounded by fire crews and desperate parents. She would later tell investigators that she had only been gone for a few minutes, but receipts and surveillance video told the truth. She had been away long enough to doom every child inside. The aftermath was chaos. Parents rushed to the scene, some collapsing to the ground, as firefighters confirmed what had happened. Houston media captured the raw grief of mothers and fathers begging for their children, only to be told they were gone. In a single morning, 4 families were shattered forever. But the horror didn't end there. Instead of staying and answering for what she had done, Tata fled. Within days, she boarded a plane to Nigeria, her family's home country, and disappeared. For weeks, she was a fugitive on the run, while back in Houston, families buried their children. The manhunt stretched across continents, until finally, with the help of Interpol and US Marshals, she was tracked down in late March and extradited back to Texas. Her trial in 2012 was one of the most watched in Texas that year. Prosecutors painted her as reckless, selfish, and utterly indifferent to the lives she was entrusted with. They laid out the evidence: the stove left on, the trip to Target, the flight out of the country. They reminded the jury of every mother and father who had trusted her, and every small life lost. The defense attempted to argue it was an accident, that Tata had panicked, that she hadn't meant for anyone to die. But the jury wasn't buying it. The law was clear. Her actions went far beyond a simple mistake. Leaving children unattended with a pan of oil heating wasn't just careless, it was criminal. The most emotional moments of the trial came from the parents themselves. They testified through tears about the final mornings they kissed their children goodbye, the toys and blankets still sitting untouched at home, and the crushing guilt of having trusted the wrong person. In November 2012, Jessica Tata was convicted of felony murder for the death of one of the children and sentenced to 80 years in prison. Additional sentences for the other charges were stacked on top, but the 80 years was the centerpiece. It meant she would be in her hundreds before she would ever see freedom again. The Houston Fire Department later confirmed that the children's deaths were entirely preventable. If Tata had followed even the most basic safety standards, the fire would not have happened. She had been licensed to care for 6 children, but had 7 in her home that day. She had been trained in fire safety, but ignored it. And most damning of all, she had been trusted with lives she treated as expendable. The case sparked outrage in Texas and beyond. Lawmakers and parents called for stricter regulations on home daycares, more inspections, and harsher penalties for violations. For years afterward, her name remained synonymous with betrayal. Today, Jessica Tata sits in a Texas prison, serving what is essentially a life sentence. She was only 22 when she was convicted, but for the families of Elias, Elizabeth, Shamari, and Kendall, her youth offers no comfort. This wasn't a moment of sudden rage or unpredictable violence. This was negligence, plain and simple. A choice made out of selfishness. She could have taken the kids with her. She could have turned off the stove. She could have done a dozen simple things, but she didn't. And for that, 4 children paid the ultimate price.
The jarring image of Charlie on the hospital operating table while holding his lifeless hand, it still hurts so much. I wish I could erase that day. I wish I had Charlie in my arms.
In DeKalb County, Georgia, the promise of affordable childcare seemed like salvation for working parents. They wanted someone local, someone friendly, someone who could watch their babies while they went to work. That person was Amanda Hickey, a mother herself who opened her home to neighborhood families. She wasn't licensed, she wasn't regulated, but she promised parents she could handle their children. In reality, her choices would lead to the death of a 4-month-old baby and expose a chilling pattern of abuse caught on video. The story begins in 2021. Amanda Hickey ran what she called a home daycare, but in truth, it was nothing more than a crowded room in her residence. Georgia law is clear. To care for multiple children, a provider must be licensed and follow strict safety rules. Hickey ignored all of that. She took in more infants than the law allowed, operating far beyond capacity. Parents, desperate for affordable options, didn't always ask questions. They saw a mother offering childcare, and they trusted her. But behind the doors of Hickey's home, cameras would later reveal a nightmare. Babies were left strapped in car seats for hours at a time, crying unattended. She ignored their needs, sometimes even covering their mouths to quiet them. Investigators later found recordings showing her physically handling infants in ways that were cruel and dangerous. What those tapes captured was not a caretaker. It was someone who treated the most vulnerable lives as burdens. On September 9th, 2021, one of those infants, a 4-month-old boy, was left in Hickey's care. That morning, he was healthy, alert, and playful. By the afternoon, he was gone. Paramedics rushed to the home after a frantic 911 call, but it was too late. The baby had died under her watch. At first, Hickey claimed it was sudden infant death syndrome, but investigators quickly saw through her story. The evidence suggested neglect, mishandling, and a dangerous environment that no child should have been subjected to. The DeKalb County District Attorney's Office launched a full investigation. What they uncovered was damning. Not only had Hickey been operating without a license, she had already been warned in the past. Complaints had been filed, but she continued to open her doors, continued to advertise childcare, and continued to exceed legal capacity. The video evidence sealed her fate. It showed patterns of rough treatment toward multiple babies, proving that what happened wasn't an accident. It was part of a disturbing pattern. In 2023, Amanda Hickey was indicted on charges of second-degree murder and multiple counts of child cruelty. Facing overwhelming evidence, she entered what's known as an Alford plea. That meant she didn't admit guilt outright, but acknowledged that the prosecution had enough evidence to convict her. It was, in effect, a guilty plea without the words. The court accepted it. The sentencing was devastating to hear. She received 35 years in prison, with 30 of those to be served. That means she will spend merely the rest of her life behind bars, her name forever tied to one of Georgia's darkest childcare tragedies. For the family of the infant boy, no sentence could ever be enough. His parents described him as a light in their lives, a baby who loved to smile, a child who never had the chance to grow up. In court, through tears, they said they trusted Amanda Hickey because she was a mother herself. They believed she would protect their son. Instead, they buried him before his first birthday. What makes this case so chilling isn't just the death of one baby. It's the knowledge that there were others. Other infants left in her care, other children subjected to the same cruelty, and only one family who received the tragic call that their child would never come home. The videos captured the reality. They showed babies treated as nuisances instead of lives worth protecting. They showed a woman entrusted with innocence, discarding it as inconvenience. Today, Amanda Hickey sits in a Georgia state prison. She will be in her 50s by the time she is eligible for release. The tragedy also serves as a reminder of a brutal truth. Childcare is one of the most vulnerable industries in America. Parents, often desperate, sometimes choose based on cost and convenience, and predators, or simply reckless people, exploit that desperation.
My name is Lindsay Partin, and I have been in prison for the last 3 years for something I didn't do.
They just pulled the plug on this child. This child is dead.
Oh my God!
In March 2018, a quiet neighborhood in Butler County, Ohio, was shaken by a tragedy that exposed how quickly trust can turn into devastation. Parents left their 3-year-old daughter, Hannah Wesche, in the care of a familiar face, a babysitter named Lindsay Partin. She was not a stranger. She lived just a few houses down from Hannah's family. To them, she was a neighbor, a trusted caretaker, and someone who had watched Hannah many times before. But within hours, Hannah would be in the hospital with catastrophic brain injuries, and within days, she would be gone. The case began on the morning of March 8, 2018. Hannah's father, Jason Wesche, dropped her off at Partin's house before work. According to investigators, she was healthy, playful, and excited to start her day. Less than 30 minutes later, Partin called 911. On the line, she claimed Hannah had collapsed suddenly after being dropped off. She said the little girl had gone limp, fallen unconscious, and stopped breathing. Paramedics rushed Hannah to Cincinnati Children's Hospital, where doctors discovered a grim reality. She had suffered severe brain swelling and internal injuries consistent with trauma. She was placed on life support, but the damage was irreversible. 2 days later, Hannah was pronounced dead. At first, Partin insisted it was a medical emergency, something sudden and unexplained. But as doctors examined Hannah, they saw signs that didn't fit that story. She had bruising on her chest, neck, and face, marks that looked like they came from force, not illness. The coroner later confirmed Hannah had died from blunt force trauma to the head, injuries so severe they could not have come from a simple fall. The investigation quickly zeroed in on Partin. Detectives noted her story kept changing. At one point, she claimed Hannah had fallen on the driveway. Another time, she said the toddler hit her head on the floor. Later, she admitted she had slapped Hannah that morning, though she insisted it was only to wake her after she collapsed. Each version contradicted the last, and none of them explained the extensive trauma revealed in the autopsy. When the case went to trial in 2019, it gripped Ohio. Prosecutors laid out a clear narrative. Hannah had been violently shaken and struck by the very woman trusted to care for her. They presented medical experts who testified that her injuries were consistent with child abuse, not an accident. One doctor told the jury bluntly, "A 3-year-old doesn't just collapse. These were inflicted injuries." The courtroom was packed with reporters, neighbors, and grieving family members. Hannah's father sat through testimony, describing the final hours of his daughter's life. In his victim statement, he said, "My little girl trusted you. We trusted you, and you stole her future." The words brought the courtroom to silence. The defense tried to cast doubt, focusing on the science of shaken baby syndrome, which has been debated in some courts. They argued Hannah could have collapsed from a medical condition or an earlier accident. They emphasized that Lindsay Partin was a mother herself, with no history of violence, and portrayed her as overwhelmed, not malicious. But the jury didn't buy it. After hearing the evidence, they found Lindsay Partin guilty of murder, involuntary manslaughter, and child endangerment. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years. In other words, she would not even be eligible for release until 2037. The sentencing was emotional. Judge Gregory Howard told Partin her actions had irrevocably altered the course of multiple lives and emphasized the trust she had broken. In 2020, Partin appealed her conviction, arguing the trial court had made errors in admitting evidence and in jury instructions. The Ohio Court of Appeals upheld the verdict, ruling that the evidence against her was overwhelming. She remained behind bars, her name now permanently linked with betrayal and tragedy. What makes this case particularly haunting is how ordinary it seemed at first. This wasn't a daycare scandal or an unknown stranger. This was a babysitter next door. If you can't trust the woman across the street, who can you trust? Experts reminded parents to research caregivers thoroughly, even if they are neighbors or family friends. Today, Lindsay Partin sits in prison, serving a life sentence. She maintains her innocence, but the courts and the community have made their judgment. Lindsay Partin belongs on this list because her crime embodies the most terrifying truth for parents everywhere. Sometimes evil isn't obvious. Sometimes it smiles at you from across the street, assures you your child will be safe, and then destroys that safety in the worst way imaginable. When a parent leaves their children with a babysitter, they're not just hiring help, they're placing their entire trust in someone else. And when that babysitter is also a close friend, someone you call sis or best friend forever, the trust is even deeper. That's why what happened in Carroll County, Mississippi, is almost impossible to comprehend. A young mother trusted her friend, Macallie Elizabeth Durham, to care for her 2 daughters. Instead, Durham betrayed her in the most devastating way imaginable, taking the life of one child and nearly destroying another. On September 15, 2022, Durham was babysitting 2 sisters, a toddler just 2 years old and her baby sister. They were innocent, defenseless, and completely dependent on the person left to watch over them. But by the end of that day, one would be dead and the other would be left fighting for her life. The toddler's injuries were catastrophic. She was pronounced dead soon after. Her little sister was found beaten and badly injured, but she survived. From the very beginning, investigators knew this wasn't an accident. These were not the kind of injuries caused by a fall or a mishap in the home. They were deliberate, inflicted with intent. The arrest of 23-year-old Durham sent shockwaves through the Carroll County community. Parents couldn't believe it. Neighbors described the case as almost too painful to even talk about. And when the children's mother later posted her grief online, the heartbreak was compounded by betrayal. She asked the haunting question, "How could you be my friend, sis, BFF?" The babysitter wasn't just someone she hired. She was part of her circle, someone she trusted like family. And that trust had been shattered forever. As the case unfolded, the details grew even darker. Prosecutors said the toddler had suffered blunt force trauma so severe it ended her life. Her baby sister was also attacked, left with physical injuries that would scar her long after the bruises faded. The betrayal of friendship made an already horrific crime feel even more cruel, as if Durham had weaponized the trust of someone who considered her family. Sheriff Clint Walker called it one of the worst crimes he'd ever seen in his decades of law enforcement. Durham was charged with capital murder for the death of the toddler and felony child abuse for the injuries to the surviving child. In March 2024, rather than face a lengthy trial and a mountain of damning evidence, she pled guilty. The courtroom was packed that day. The children's family sat together, broken, but determined to see justice served. The sentence was heavy and final. For the capital murder charge, Durham was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. For the child abuse charge, she received an additional 40 years. At just 23 years old, her life outside prison walls was effectively over. What made the day even harder to bear was the absence of answers. In that packed courtroom, Durham gave no motive. There was no explanation, no apology that could touch the damage done. She sat, listened, and said little. For many in attendance, that silence was almost as chilling as the facts. How does someone who's been embraced like family turn and destroy the very children she was trusted to protect? Today, she sits inside the Mississippi Department of Corrections, sentenced to die behind bars. Meanwhile, the family she betrayed continues to live with an unfillable void. A mother without her child, a sister without her sibling, in a community forever haunted by the reminder that sometimes the danger isn't a stranger in the shadows. Sometimes is the person you trusted most, smiling at you, calling you sis.
No, I'm not okay. They're trying to f me up. I'm like, so can I go? Can I get my keys? Can I go get my kids? Can I go do this? He's like, we'll let you know in a minute. We'll let you know in a minute. I'm like, are you taking me to jail? Like, are you about to ruin my f***ing life?
Babysitters are supposed to be protectors, trusted adults. Parents rely on when they can't be there. They're invited into homes, handed the most precious responsibility of all, a child's safety. But in December 2020, in Sandy Springs, Georgia, that sacred trust was shattered. 29-year-old Kirsty Hannah Flood wasn't a protector. She wasn't a safe pair of hands. She was a predator, hiding in plain sight. Her victim was 2-year-old Fallon Fridley, a bright, energetic toddler with her whole life ahead of her. Fallon's family thought they were making the safe choice. Kirsty wasn't some stranger. They had known her for years. She was a longtime friend of Fallon's mother, someone close enough to be considered part of the inner circle. If anyone could be trusted with Fallon, it was her, or so they thought. On December 9th, 2020, paramedics were called to the family's apartment complex. Fallon was unresponsive. Kirsty claimed the toddler had fallen at the playground, hitting her head on the slide. A freak accident, she insisted. But doctors at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta didn't buy it. Fallon's injuries weren't consistent with a playground tumble. They were catastrophic, severe head trauma, and internal injuries. Within hours, the little girl was gone. The death of a child always raises questions, but this one raised red flags immediately. Sandy Springs police launched a full homicide investigation, and when detectives began digging into Flood's background, the mask of trusted babysitter fell apart. The most chilling discovery came from Flood's phone. Investigators uncovered a series of Google searches no one could explain away. Phrases like, "What type of people enjoy abusing other people's children?" and "What does it mean to have a sudden urge to hurt a child?" Another read, "How to cover up child abuse." These weren't searches made years before, buried in an old browser history. They were made close in time to Fallon's death. They revealed a mindset steeped in violence, curiosity about abuse, and an obsession with the very crime she would commit. Prosecutors would later argue that those searches were a window into Kirsty's true nature, proof that Fallon's death wasn't a tragic accident, but the result of calculated cruelty. She had been thinking about harming children, researching it, and them acting on those impulses. The autopsy confirmed the worst. Fallon had suffered blunt force injuries that no playground accident could explain. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide. The cause? Repeated blows to the head. At that point, Kirsty's playground story collapsed completely. Community reaction was immediate and furious. Fallon's smiling photos circulated online. Vigils were held, pink balloons released into the air, neighbors tying ribbons outside the apartment building. For parents across Georgia, the betrayal cut deep. This wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. It was a woman welcomed into a family's home, treated like a friend, trusted with a child's life, and she had destroyed it. Flood was arrested and charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, and cruelty to children. At her first court appearance, she showed little emotion. Reporters in the courtroom noted how detached she seemed, as though she wasn't fully grasping or didn't care about the enormity of what she had done. The case dragged on for years. Appeals, delays, and procedural wrangling kept it in the headlines. During that time, more disturbing details leaked out. Prosecutors revealed that Flood's boyfriend, Jeffrey Myers, wasn't innocent either. He had knowledge of the abuse and failed to stop it. He eventually pled guilty to related charges and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. It was another devastating betrayal. One more adult who should have stepped in to protect Fallon, and instead chose silence. Fallon's mother attended every hearing. She sat in court and stared at the woman who had once been her friend, now accused of killing her daughter. She gave emotional statements about the milestones she would never see. Fallon's first day of school, birthdays, graduations, all stolen in one horrific act of violence. By 2024, facing overwhelming evidence, Kirsty finally gave up the charade. She pled guilty to malice murder. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will never walk free again. The sentencing hearing was brutal. Fallon's family confronted her directly. They demanded answers that Kirsty refused to give. She sat silent, while Fallon's mother described the emptiness left behind. As of 2025, Kirsty Hannah Flood sits in a Georgia prison, serving life without parole. Jeffrey Myers serves his 15-year sentence. Neither will ever be remembered as anything other than what they are, betrayers who turned trust into tragedy.
She was only 3. She barely said a couple words. She didn't bother nobody. Just the thought that she suffered. I can't get that out of my mind. She suffered. You're gonna pay for what you did to her. You will.
Detroit, Michigan, 2024. A family trusted a woman to care for their 3-year-old daughter, Harmony Henderson. They believed she would be safe, loved, and supervised, while her mother was at work. That trust was betrayed in the worst way possible. The babysitter's name was Iesha Harris, and what unfolded inside her home would end Harmony's life, devastate a family, and leave a city asking how such evil could hide behind a familiar face. On June 10th, 2024, Harmony was dropped off at Harris's home daycare. The little girl was full of energy, her family later said, and loved singing and dancing. She was also autistic and nonverbal, which only made her more dependent on the adults around her. To her mother, she was the center of her world. She had no reason to doubt Harris, who had been caring for Harmony regularly. But that morning, something changed. Investigators revealed that instead of watching the children, Harris locked them in a room and smoked marijuana, choosing to get high while the toddler she was paid to protect was left helpless and vulnerable. Later, over something as petty as Harmony having an accident in her pull-up, Harris snapped. She dragged the 3-year-old into the bathroom, poured scalding water over her, and slammed her head against the bathtub. By the time the child was rushed to a Detroit hospital, it was too late. She had suffered fatal injuries, and doctors were unable to save her. Harris told investigators a series of shifting stories, at first suggesting Harmony had fallen, then claiming she didn't know what happened. But the medical examiner's report told the truth. The injuries were intentional, not accidental. The case sent shockwaves through Detroit. Local news stations like Fox 2 and WDIV carried live updates as the community struggled to understand how a trusted caregiver could become a killer. Outside the courthouse, posters of Harmony's smiling face were held by grieving relatives demanding justice. In September 2024, Harris was formally charged with second-degree murder and first-degree child abuse. The courtroom filled with raw emotion. They emphasized that this was not a tragic accident, but a violent act. The trial moved quickly into 2025, with video footage from inside the courtroom making national headlines. Harris sat silently as prosecutors replayed the timeline of June 10th. Family members sobbed openly as photos of Harmony were displayed. Photos of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days that would now never come again. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Harris entered a guilty plea. In January 2025, she admitted responsibility for Harmony's death. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read her sentence: 28 to 50 years in prison. It meant Harris would not be eligible for parole until she was well into middle age, and even then, she would carry the label of a child killer forever. The case also exposed broader problems in Michigan's childcare system. Harris's home daycare was unlicensed, operating outside the oversight of state regulators. That fact became a rallying point for community activists and lawmakers who demanded stricter enforcement and more resources to help parents of that childcare providers. Today, Iesha Harris sits in a Michigan prison, serving a sentence that could keep her behind bars for decades. But for Harmony's family, no sentence will ever be enough. They must live every day without their little girl, haunted by the thought that the person they trusted most turned out to be her killer. Some crimes are immediate, a violent act, a victim, a swift consequence. But other crimes take years, even decades, before justice arrives. That's what makes the case of babysitter Terry Mccertie one of the most unusual and haunting childcare tragedies in American history. It began in Florida in 1984, when a 5-month-old baby named Benjamin Dowling suffered catastrophic injuries under her watch, and it would not end until 2024, 40 years later, when Mccertie finally admitted her role in his death. The story starts in July 1984. Benjamin's parents left him in the care of Mccertie, then 22 years old, while they worked. Within hours, he was rushed to a hospital with severe head trauma, bleeding in the brain, and permanent neurological damage. Doctors immediately suspected shaken baby syndrome, a form of abuse caused when an infant is violently shaken. The injuries were devastating. Benjamin survived, but he would never walk, talk, or live independently again. His parents became full-time caregivers, dedicating their lives to keeping him comfortable. Back then, Mccertie denied harming the baby. She claimed he had suddenly gone limp and unresponsive while in her care, but prosecutors believed otherwise. In 1985, she was charged with attempted murder, accused of violently shaking Benjamin. The case went to trial, but the jury deadlocked. In 1986, facing the possibility of a retrial, she accepted a plea deal to a lesser charge of aggravated battery. The sentence? 3 years of probation, no jail time. For Benjamin's family, it felt like an injustice, but at least their son was alive. And so, the case sat, unresolved in the eyes of many, while Benjamin grew up severely disabled. For decades, his family fought quietly, providing around-the-clock care. Mccertie moved on with her life. She married, had children of her own, and lived quietly in South Dakota, far from the Florida courtroom where her name had once made headlines. Then, in 2019, everything changed. At the age of 35, Benjamin Dowling passed away from complications directly tied to the brain injuries he had sustained back in 1984. His death certificate listed those injuries as the cause. For prosecutors, it reopened the case. What had once been an assault was now a homicide. The concept is called a delayed homicide. If a victim dies years later from injuries inflicted during an attack, the person responsible can still be charged. And that's exactly what happened. In 2021, Mccertie was indicted for first-degree murder, nearly 4 decades after the crime. The case made national headlines. Reporters called it one of the longest gaps between crime and prosecution in American history. Mccertie, now in her late 50s, was extradited back to Florida. Cameras followed her into court, showing an older woman facing justice for something she had done as a young babysitter decades before. Her defense team argued that too much time had passed, that memories had faded, that medical science had changed. They claimed she should not be judged for something that happened 40 years earlier. But prosecutors had a simple response. Benjamin had lived his entire life disabled because of her actions, and his death was the final consequence of the violence she inflicted. Time did not erase responsibility. In August 2024, Mccertie finally admitted guilt. She accepted a plea deal for manslaughter, acknowledging her role in Benjamin's death. As part of the agreement, she was sentenced to 36 months in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. She was also required to write a detailed apology letter and personal account of what happened that day in 1984, a condition designed to give the family some measure of truth after decades of silence. For Benjamin's parents, the sentencing was bittersweet. They had spent 35 years caring for a child whose every need stemmed from one violent act. They had fought for justice when others had forgotten. Now, finally, a court had recognized that Benjamin's death was not an accident. It was homicide. Still, the 3-year prison term felt small compared to a lifetime of suffering. His father told reporters, "We did this for Ben. We did this so his life and his death wouldn't be ignored." The case fascinated legal experts because of its rarity. Few homicide prosecutions are ever delayed by decades. But the law was clear. A killer cannot escape accountability simply because the victim lived longer than expected. In fact, prosecutors said Benjamin's survival was a testament to his strength and to his family's devotion. Today, Terry Mccertie sits in prison, serving her sentence. She is no longer the young woman accused in 1985, but the weight of her actions never disappeared. The Dowling family continues to grieve Benjamin, remembering the boy he might have been had he not been shaken as an infant. His story is a reminder that time does not heal all wounds. Some scars stretch across decades.
I'll never forget that interrogation.
I got angry.
Yeah.
And I went, boom.
Why'd you do that?
They were saying those exact words.
Did you pull him down? Because that's, you did. How hard? Show me with the down.
How could you ever admit to something?
What they do to you in there, it's a nightmare.
I'm just kind of curious how much more. Because I just want to go home and spend time with my parents and my puppy.
Do you blame someone for this?
Mostly blame myself. I wish I was stronger.
Some crimes leave no doubt. Others spark years of debate, appeals, and heated arguments about guilt or innocence. The case of Melissa Calusinski, a daycare worker from Illinois, is one of the most controversial childcare tragedies in modern American history. In 2009, a toddler named Benjamin Kingen died at her daycare. In 2011, she was convicted of his murder. And in 2025, her name is still in the headlines as supporters fight for her release. To some, she is a killer. To others, she is a scapegoat. But no matter which side you believe, her story has become one of the most infamous babysitter cases in the United States. The story begins on January 14th, 2009. 2-year-old Benjamin was at the Mccertie in the Park Daycare Center in Lincolnshire, Illinois. Melissa Calusinski, a 22-year-old teacher's aide, was one of the workers on duty. That afternoon, Benjamin suddenly collapsed. Paramedics rushed him to a hospital, but he could not be revived. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull and massive brain swelling. Investigators quickly zeroed in on Calusinski. Other workers claimed she had been frustrated with the children that day, and prosecutors argued she threw Benjamin to the ground in anger. Within weeks, she was interrogated by police. The interrogation lasted more than 9 hours. Eventually, Calusinski said words prosecutors would later use against her, that she had thrown Benjamin to the floor. It was enough for them to charge her with first-degree murder. But from the very beginning, the case was filled with controversy. Supporters of Calusinski argued that her confession was coerced. She had a documented intellectual disability with the comprehension skills of a teenager and had been worn down by hours of questioning. They pointed out that she changed her story multiple times under pressure and that police fed her details. Even Benjamin's parents admitted they never fully understood why she confessed in the way she did. At trial in 2011, prosecutors leaned heavily on the confession. They told the jury that Calusinski had lost her temper, hurled Benjamin to the ground, and lied about it until the interrogation forced the truth out. The defense countered with medical experts who suggested Benjamin's death could have been caused by an old injury that suddenly worsened. They argued there was no physical evidence linking Calusinski to the act, only her own confused words under intense questioning. The jury sided with the prosecution. Calusinski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 31 years in prison. She would not be eligible for release until the 2040s. For Benjamin's family, it was justice. For Calusinski's supporters, it was a miscarriage of justice. Over the years, new evidence surfaced that fueled the debate. In 2014, a former coroner testified that X-rays showing signs of an old injury had been withheld during the original trial. In 2015, defense attorneys filed motions arguing that the autopsy results had been misinterpreted. And in 2016, Illinois' 2nd District Appellate Court ordered a new hearing, though the conviction ultimately stood. Despite losing appeals, Calusinski's case refused to fade. Advocacy groups rallied behind her, claiming she was wrongfully convicted. Documentaries, podcasts, and national news outlets revisited her story. CBS's 48 Hours produced segments highlighting doubts in the prosecution's case, questioning whether her confession could really be trusted. By 2025, the controversy only grew louder. Calusinski's attorneys filed a clemency petition with Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, arguing she had already served more than a decade in prison for a crime she did not commit. Supporters flooded social media, pointing to her low IQ, the marathon interrogation, and the medical disputes as proof she had been railroaded. Meanwhile, Benjamin's family pushed back, reminding the public that a jury had convicted her and that their child's death was not an abstract debate, but a devastating reality. Inside prison, Calusinski has maintained her innocence. In letters to journalists, she has said she never hurt Benjamin and only confessed because she was confused and exhausted. Prosecutors, however, remain firm. They insist the conviction was sound, the confession was voluntary, and the medical evidence supports their case. What makes this case so gripping and so divisive is the clash between two powerful narratives. On one side, a daycare worker convicted of killing a child in her care. On the other, a vulnerable young woman, possibly manipulated into confessing to something she didn't do. The truth, many believe, may never be fully known. But what cannot be denied is the outcome. A 2-year-old boy is dead. His family has spent 16 years living with a loss no parent should endure. And a babysitter, guilty or not, has spent those same years behind bars, her name forever tied to one of Illinois' darkest childcare cases.
I'm just asking for mercy, nothing else.
If you turn Gertrude Baniszewski loose, you might as well put me in prison, because I would be in prison in my own home for afraid to go anywhere by myself again.
When people think of babysitters, they imagine safety, warmth, someone filling the gap when parents cannot be there. But in Indiana, 1965, one woman twisted that role into something monstrous. Her name was Gertrude Baniszewski, and the story of how she tortured and murdered a teenage girl entrusted to her care has been called one of the most shocking crimes in American history. To this day, it is remembered as a case that reveals just how far human cruelty can go when trust is placed in the wrong hands. The victim was Sylvia Likens, a 16-year-old girl whose parents worked as carnival laborers. They often traveled, leaving Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny in need of temporary care. In July 1965, they made what seemed like a practical arrangement. They paid Gertrude Baniszewski, a 37-year-old mother of 7, $20 a week to board and watch their daughters. On paper, it looked like a safe solution. In reality, it was the beginning of a nightmare. At first, Gertrude treated Sylvia and Jenny like guests in her crowded Indianapolis home, but soon her resentment grew. When payments from Sylvia's parents arrived late, Baniszewski took out her anger on Sylvia. What began as verbal abuse escalated into physical violence, and then into something far darker. Over the weeks and months that followed, Sylvia became the target of escalating cruelty, not only from Baniszewski, but also from her children and neighborhood kids whom she encouraged to join in. Gertrude framed it as discipline, convincing others that Sylvia was misbehaving. In truth, she was orchestrating systematic torture. Sylvia was denied food, forced to eat scraps, and beaten regularly. Baniszewski manipulated the other children into participating, turning abuse into a grotesque group activity. Neighbors would later testify that screams were sometimes heard from the house, but no one intervened. The final weeks of Sylvia's life were unspeakable. One of the most infamous acts of the abuse was when Baniszewski forced another child to carve words into Sylvia's skin, an act meant to permanently mark and humiliate her. By October 1965, Sylvia's body could no longer endure the torture. On October 26th, she died on a mattress in the Baniszewski home. She was just 16 years old. When police arrived, they were confronted with a scene so horrific, it shocked even veteran investigators. Sylvia's body was emaciated and scarred. The level of abuse she had endured was beyond anything they had seen in a supposed babysitting arrangement. It was immediately clear this was not just neglect, but deliberate, organized cruelty. Gertrude Baniszewski was arrested, along with several of her children and neighborhood youths who had participated in the abuse. The trial in 1966 became one of the most infamous in Indiana history. Witness after witness described the torment Sylvia had suffered. The jury heard how Gertrude encouraged her children to beat Sylvia, how she withheld food and medical care, and how she turned the home into what prosecutors called a house of torture. The most haunting testimony came from Sylvia's sister Jenny, who had also lived in the house and endured abuse, though not as severe. Jenny, frail and terrified, told the court what she had witnessed. At the end of her testimony, she reportedly whispered to one attorney, "You get me out of here, and I'll tell you everything." Her words solidified the case against Gertrude. In May 1966, Gertrude Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Several of her children and local teenagers received lesser sentences for their roles. For many, it felt like justice, but it didn't erase the horror of what Sylvia had endured. Shockingly, Gertrude's story wouldn't end there. In 1985, after serving 20 years, she was paroled. The decision outraged the public. Hundreds of letters poured in demanding she remain behind bars, but parole was granted. She lived quietly in Iowa until her death from cancer in 1990. For Sylvia's family, The knowledge that her killer had walked free was a final, bitter injustice. The case of Gertrude Baniszewski has been retold countless times in books, documentaries, and even films because it represents something almost unimaginable. Parents paying a caregiver, expecting love and safety, only to have their child subjected to systematic torture and death. It is often called the most notorious child abuse case in American history. The story is a permanent scar on Indiana's history and a lesson that must never be forgotten. From the sitter who staged a dead infant as if asleep to the one who fled the country while children burned, these 10 cases reveal the darkest betrayal of all, the destruction of trust in those sworn to protect our children. They were hired to watch, to guard, to nurture. Instead, they became predators hiding in plain sight. Their actions scarred families, shook communities, and remind us that sometimes the greatest danger is the person you trust most. These are, without question, the most evil babysitters in history. If you found this exploration of shocking cases compelling, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know in the comments which of these cases disturbed you the most.